The millionaire took her without mercy. She trembled, lacking the courage to reveal. When he discovered her purity, he stopped. "My child will be with you," he whispered. What's your guess for the end of this story? Write in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and tell us which city you're following us from. I'm certain this will be the most emotional story you'll ever hear. Victoria Montgomery took a deep breath as she looked out over New York City from her father's office window. The gray sky matched her mood that autumn morning. At 25, she never imagined she would be about to make such a definitive decision. The family company, Montgomery Architecture, once a respected empire throughout America, was on the brink of bankruptcy after a series of unsuccessful investments and the economic crisis that had ravaged the country. On the floor below, employees, many with decades of dedication, continued their work without knowing that the next paycheck might not exist. Victoria felt the weight of this responsibility in every breath. It wasn't just 3 generations' legacy at stake, but the livelihood of hundreds of families. "Daughter, do you understand we have no other option?" August Montgomery, her father, a 60-year-old man whose gray hair and deep dark circles betrayed sleepless nights, approached her with slow steps. "Henry Blackwell's proposal is our only way out." Henry Blackwell. The name echoed in her mind like an omen. CEO of the Blackwell Group, a conglomerate that dominated the American real estate market, he was known not only for his billion-dollar fortune, but for the coldness with which he conducted business. At 40, he had never married, and rumors about his personal life were as scarce as his public displays of emotion. "Dad, there must be another way. A new loan. Perhaps a foreign investor," Victoria argued, knowing she was merely repeating alternatives already dismissed. "We've tried everything, you know that." August sat down, passing his hands over his tired face. "Henry is willing to inject the necessary capital and keep the company running, with all jobs guaranteed. In exchange, he wants a wife," Victoria completed, her voice a mixture of resignation and defiance. "He wants me to become Mrs. Blackwell." The proposal had arrived 3 days earlier, after a meeting between August and Henry. It wasn't presented as a direct imposition, but as a suggestion wrapped in financial terms. An agreement that included marriage to Victoria, the preservation of the company, and a guarantee that the Montgomery family would maintain a position on the board, albeit a minority one. "I don't want you to think I'm selling my daughter." August rose abruptly, guilt evident in his voice. "If there's any other solution, any at all." "I've already read the prenuptial agreement," Victoria interrupted with a calmness she didn't feel. "The conditions are clear." The prenuptial agreement was a 20-page document that seemed more like the acquisition of a company than a marital commitment. She would be entitled to a generous allowance, her own residence if the marriage ended after 5 years, and the guarantee that her future children would be legitimate heirs to the Blackwell fortune. In return, she would need to behave as the perfect wife, accompany him to social events and, though not explicitly stated, fulfill her marital duties. "You don't have to do this, Victoria." Lauren, her younger sister, entered the office with red eyes. "We can start over even without the company." Victoria looked at her 19-year-old sister, who dreamed of finishing medical school. How could she explain that it wasn't just the company, but Lauren's future, their Aunt Cecilia's expensive treatment, and the accumulated debts that motivated her? "I've made my decision." Victoria picked up the gold pen that had belonged to her grandfather, the founder of Montgomery Architecture. "I'm going to marry Henry Blackwell." 2 weeks later, Victoria found herself in Henry's office in Tribeca, one of New York City's most exclusive neighborhoods. The mirrored building reflected the passing clouds, as if the sky itself was fleeing from that encounter. It was the first time they would meet formally to discuss the marriage. The meeting room on the top floor was a monument to minimalism. Italian design furniture, contemporary artwork on the walls, and a panoramic view of the city. Henry waited for her standing, wearing an impeccably tailored suit. Tall, with an athletic build and defined features, He possessed a cold, inaccessible beauty. "Miss Montgomery, I appreciate your punctuality." His voice was deep and controlled, as if measuring every word. "I hope the contract meets your expectations." There was no handshake, much less the cordiality one would expect from a future husband. Just business. "I believe we've already reviewed all the terms, Mr. Blackwell." Victoria kept her chin up, determined not to show insecurity. "I'm here to confirm the date of the ceremony." 3 weeks from today, as agreed. Henry indicated a chair for her to sit. "My team has already begun preparations. It will be something discreet, just to formalize the union. We'll avoid unnecessary media exposure." Victoria nodded, feeling a chill in the pit of her stomach. 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, she would be married to a man she barely knew, who saw her as part of a business transaction. "I presume you're aware that this agreement benefits both parties," Henry continued, his dark eyes studying her with clinical interest. "Your family maintains dignity in the company. I acquire what I need to consolidate my position in the market and in society." "And what would that be, exactly?" Victoria couldn't contain the question. "What does a man with your fortune and power gain by marrying me?" An almost smile appeared on Henry's face, so brief it could have been imagined. "Legitimacy, Miss Montgomery. A wife of your stature, from a traditional family like yours, grants me access to circles that money alone can't buy." He stood up, walking to the window. "Besides, at 40, it's time to think about an heir. My shareholders will appreciate the stability that a marriage provides." The coldness with which he spoke of children, as if they were another asset in his portfolio, made Victoria shiver. However, there was no turning back. The future of many people depended on this sacrifice. "I understand." She stood up, adjusting the simple dress she wore. "I'll be ready on the appointed date." When they said goodbye, there was no gesture indicating affection or expectation, just an agreement sealed, a contract signed with both their lives. Upon leaving the building, Victoria allowed herself a moment of weakness. She leaned against a marble column and let a solitary tear escape, quickly wiped away. This wasn't how she had imagined her wedding as a girl. This wasn't the path she had dreamed of taking. But dreams, she had learned, often needed to be sacrificed in the name of greater responsibilities. And as the late afternoon sun tinged New York City golden, Victoria Montgomery walked toward a future she hadn't chosen, but would face with the same dignity that had characterized her family for generations. The wedding day dawned with a surprisingly clear sky for New York City. Victoria watched the final preparations from the window of her suite at the Pierre, where she had spent the previous night. The wedding dress, an exclusive creation by a renowned designer, hung on a hanger by the mirror. It was a stunning piece, worthy of a princess or a valuable acquisition. "You look beautiful, even with that face like you're going to the gallows," commented Julia, her best friend since childhood, the only one who knew the whole truth behind the union. "That's because I'm feeling exactly like that." Victoria tried to smile, but the gesture didn't reach her eyes. "How's everyone downstairs?" "Your father is nervous, but keeping up appearances. Lauren is doing her best to distract the guests, who aren't many as your fiancé requested." Henry had been clear about the ceremony. Only close family members and some associates, fundamental to business. The press was rigorously kept at a distance, with an official statement that would only be released after the event. Everything meticulously planned to appear elegant and discreet, not the commercial agreement it really was. As the makeup artist gave the final touches, Victoria thought about the conversation she'd had with her father the night before. August, visibly distressed, had given her a small family safe. "This belonged to your mother," he had said, his voice breaking. "She wanted you to open it on your wedding day." The safe, an antique piece in carved wood, had a complex lock. The key, according to August, was kept among the belongings that her mother had left when she passed away 5 years ago, claimed by a sudden illness. Victoria hadn't had the courage to look for it yet. That memory of her mother, Eliza, was too precious to be faced amid the turbulence of those days. "It's time," announced Julia, interrupting her thoughts. "The car is waiting." The ceremony would take place in a historic chapel in the heart of New York City, followed by a reception in the garden of a restored mansion. When Victoria arrived, she felt as if she were playing a role in a well-rehearsed play. The guests, no more than 50 people, observed her with curiosity and some with obvious pity, those who suspected the true nature of this union. Henry awaited her at the altar, impeccable in his Italian suit, his countenance serene and distant. There was no nervousness or emotion on that perfect face, just the certainty of someone closing another successful deal. Victoria walked down the aisle arm in arm with her father, her eyes fixed on the marble floor. Not out of submission, but to avoid the gazes of those present. When she finally reached the altar and August handed her over to Henry, she felt the cold touch of her future husband, a firm grip, almost. Possessive, but entirely devoid of warmth. The celebrant, a justice of the peace who was a friend of the Blackwell family, conducted the ceremony efficiently. The vows were traditional, recited with mechanical precision by both. When the moment for the kiss came, Henry leaned in with calculated gentleness, his lips touching hers in a brief and superficial contact, like the seal on a contract. The reception proceeded as planned. Soft music, first-class champagne, polite conversations. Victoria smiled when necessary, thanked the congratulations, and avoided being alone with her now husband. He, in turn, circulated among the guests with the ease of a politician, always maintaining a respectful distance from her, as if they had already previously arranged this choreography. "Are you okay?" Lauren approached discreetly, offering her a glass of water. "I'm surviving," replied Victoria, watching Henry talk with some businessmen. "How's Dad?" "Drinking more than he should. I think the guilt is weighing on him." Victoria sighed. "Tell him I'm fine, that it was my choice." "Was it really?" Lauren looked at her with inquisitive eyes. "Or was it the only exit they let us see?" Before she could answer, Henry materialized by her side. "We need to say goodbye, dear. The helicopter is waiting." The plan was to spend the night at an isolated property on the Long Island coast, a luxurious beach house that belonged to Henry. From there, they would head to a 2-week honeymoon on the Italian coast, a trip that would also allow him to close some business deals in Europe. The farewell was brief. Victoria hugged her father and sister tightly, trying to convey the confidence she didn't feel. When she entered the limousine next to Henry, the silence between them was almost a physical entity, occupying all the available space. "You behaved appropriately," he finally commented, as the car glided through the streets of New York toward the heliport. "I appreciate that." "I did no more than what was agreed," she replied, keeping her gaze fixed on the window. "Still, I recognize that the situation is not conventional. Your cooperation is appreciated." Victoria turned to face him, noticing for the first time a shadow of uncertainty in those normally impenetrable eyes. For a brief instant, she glimpsed the man behind the mask of the ruthless businessman, someone who perhaps was also navigating unknown waters. The helicopter took them over the Catskill Mountains as the sun set on the horizon. The landscape was breathtaking, but Victoria barely noticed, immersed in thoughts about the night to come. The contract didn't specify details about the couple's intimate life, but the expectations were implicit. The beach house was an impressive modernist construction, all glass and concrete, built on a cliff overlooking the ocean. Discreet staff received the luggage and quickly withdrew, leaving the couple alone. "I had a light dinner prepared," informed Henry, leading her to a terrace where a table was set. "I imagine you're tired from the day's formalities." Dinner proceeded in a silence punctuated by occasional comments about the ceremony and the guests. Henry seemed more relaxed there, away from external gazes, but still maintained the controlled posture that characterized him. Victoria, for her part, tried to mentally postpone the moment when they would have to retire to the bedroom. When finally there was no way to prolong the meal, Henry stood up and extended his hand to her. "Shall we?" The master bedroom occupied the entire upper floor of the house, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a spectacular view of the Atlantic Ocean. The king-size bed was covered with Egyptian cotton sheets, and rose petals formed a path to it, a romantic touch that seemed strangely out of place in that context. Victoria felt her heart race when Henry approached, undoing his tie with deliberately slow movements. There was no desire in his eyes, only a practical determination, like someone preparing to fulfill another obligation. "We can postpone this if you prefer," he said, surprising her. "The agreement doesn't specify deadlines for this part." "No," she replied, gathering courage. "Let's proceed." When Henry touched her, his fingers were cold against her skin. The gestures were precise, almost clinical, revealing experience, but no passion. Victoria closed her eyes, trying to mentally distance herself from the situation, but something in his touch kept her painfully present. It was when he began to unbutton her dress that she felt the first tears escape. They weren't from fear or revulsion, but from a deep sadness for what should have been a moment of surrender and affection, reduced to a contractual formality. "You're crying," he stated, stopping his movements. "It's nothing." She tried to disguise it, wiping her face. "It's just that I never with anyone before." The words came out broken, almost inaudible, but the effect on Henry was immediate. He backed away as if he had received a shock, his eyes widening in an expression of genuine surprise, the first authentic emotion she had seen in him. "You are—" He hesitated, unable to complete the sentence. "Yes," she confirmed, feeling her face burn with shame. "There has never been anyone." A dense silence fell over the room, broken only by the sound of waves crashing on the rocks below. Henry ran his hand through his hair in an involuntary gesture that betrayed his bewilderment. It was evident that this information was not included in the meticulous dossier he had certainly had prepared about her. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he finally asked, his voice softer than Victoria had ever heard. "I didn't think it made a difference to the agreement," she replied, with a dignity she didn't know she possessed at that moment. Henry stared at her for a long time, as if seeing her for real for the first time. Then, without saying a word, he picked up the silk robe that was on a chair and handed it to her. "Rest," he said, heading for the door. "Tomorrow will be a new day." And he left, leaving Victoria alone with her tears and the beginning of something she still didn't understand, the first crack in Henry Blackwell's impenetrable armor. The next morning brought with it the constant rumor of the waves and a brightness that invaded the room through the half-open curtains. Victoria woke up, disoriented for a moment, forgetting where she was and what had happened. Reality returned gradually. The wedding, the cold ceremony, and the previous night, that moment of vulnerability that had inexplicably changed the atmosphere between her and Henry. She rose slowly, noticing she was alone in the room. On the chair near the window, she found a tray with breakfast and an envelope with her name written in Henry's precise handwriting. Inside, a concise note: "Had to resolve some matters by phone. I'll be on the beach when you're ready to come. Down. H." After a long shower, Victoria dressed simply, linen shorts and a light blouse, and went down to look for her husband. The house, seen in daylight, was even more impressive. Minimalist and elegant, every detail seemed to have been meticulously thought out to create an atmosphere of sophistication without ostentation. She found Henry on the private beach, sitting in a wooden chair, contemplating the ocean. He wore light pants and a cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, a more relaxed version of the always formal man she had known. Next to him, a closed laptop suggested he had indeed worked before her arrival. "Good morning," she greeted him, stopping a few steps away. Henry turned around, and Victoria noticed something different in his gaze, a softness that wasn't there before. "Good morning. Did you sleep well?" "Yes, thank you." She sat in the empty chair beside him. "And you?" "Enough." He definitely closed the laptop, as if deciding to give her his complete attention, an unprecedented gesture. "About last night." "We don't need to talk about it," interrupted Victoria, feeling her face heat up. "On the contrary, we do." Henry leaned slightly in her direction. "I realize there are gaps in my understanding of you. This is not acceptable in a partnership. Even one like ours. Partnership. The word hung between them, neither entirely true nor completely false. They weren't partners in the conventional sense, but they weren't just parts of a contract either, not anymore after that night. "What do you want to know?" she asked, surprising herself with the willingness for that conversation. "Everything. That's relevant. For example, why someone like you, young, intelligent, from a good family, never had a serious relationship." The question was direct, almost invasive, but there was a genuine curiosity in it. Victoria took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. "My mother fell ill when I was 20, she began, looking at the horizon. "It was a difficult time. I was in architecture school, dividing my time between studies and the hospital. After she was gone, I needed to help my father with the company, take on responsibilities. There wasn't much room left for romance." Henry nodded, as if that made sense on some deep level that she couldn't access. "And there was no one worth the effort," Victoria smiled slightly. "There were suitors, of course, but they always seemed to want something I couldn't give. My time, my full attention, or worse, access to my family's company." "And now you're married to someone who explicitly wanted that access," he observed, with surprising self-criticism. "At least you were honest about it," she replied, looking at him directly. "You didn't pretend to have feelings that didn't exist." A contemplative silence established itself between them, filled only by the sound of the waves and seabirds. There was something almost peaceful in that shared moment, as if a first layer of ice had melted. "What happens now?" Victoria finally asked. "With the honeymoon, with everything?" Henry stood up, extending his hand to help her, another unprecedented gesture. "I suggest we use this time to get to know each other better. The trip to Italy is confirmed for tomorrow, but if you prefer to cancel—" "No," she interrupted, accepting the offered hand. "Let's follow the plan. We just need to adjust it, perhaps." The following 2 weeks passed in a surprising manner. Italy, with its historical beauty and breathtaking landscapes, served as the backdrop for a gradual approach that neither had planned. Henry, still reserved by nature, began to show increasing interest in their conversations, waiting for Victoria to finish her breakfast before leaving for appointments, asking her opinion about restaurants, and even cancelling a meeting when he noticed she was fascinated with a visit to an art gallery in Florence. Victoria, in turn, discovered facets of Henry that the business dossier certainly didn't mention. He had a deep knowledge of art history, spoke fluent Italian, and had a subtle sense of humor that he rarely let show. During dinner at a family trattoria in Positano, he actually smiled genuinely when she tried unsuccessfully to correctly pronounce the name of a regional dish. "You have a beautiful smile," she impulsively commented. "You should use it more, often." Henry seemed genuinely surprised by the observation. "I haven't had many reasons to smile in recent years," he replied, with disarming honesty. "Why, you have everything most people dream of having." "Material possessions rarely bring authentic happiness, only comfort," he answered, twirling the glass of red wine between his fingers. "I learned that by watching my father." It was the first time he had mentioned his family, and Victoria seized the opportunity. "What was your family like?" A shadow crossed Henry's face. "Dysfunctional would be the polite term. My father built an empire and destroyed everything else in the process, including my mother." "She—" Victoria hesitated, not knowing how to formulate the question. "Couldn't bear the pressure and his constant extramarital affairs. She left home when I was 12. I never saw her again." The revelation hung between them like a silent explanation for much of Henry's behavior: his distrust, his obsessive focus on work, his inability to show emotions. "I'm sorry," said Victoria sincerely. "It was a long time ago," he replied, but the tone of his voice suggested that the wound was still open. "I think in a way I never completely got over it." That confession, as unexpected as it was revealing, marked a turning point in the relationship. In the days that followed, as they explored the Amalfi Coast, a subtle complicity began to form between them. It wasn't love, not even explicit physical attraction, but a mutual understanding that neither had anticipated. On the last night of the trip, Staying at an exclusive villa on the outskirts of Rome, Henry surprised her with a gift, a delicate set of watercolors she had admired in an art gallery. "For when you go back to drawing," he explained, referring to a casual conversation in which Victoria had mentioned her abandoned passion for architectural drawing. "How did you know I wanted this?" she asked, genuinely touched by the gesture. "I observed the way you looked at them," he simply replied. "Your eyes lit up." It was the first time he had shown he had paid attention to something so personal and subtle about her. Victoria felt something moving inside her, not gratitude but a kind of recognition, as if she was finally seeing the man behind the facade of the ruthless businessman. That night, when Henry approached her in the shared room, they had maintained a respectful distance throughout the trip. There wasn't the calculated coldness of the wedding night. His gestures were cautious, almost reverent, and his eyes constantly sought hers as if asking permission. "We don't have to do anything you don't want," he whispered, caressing her face with surprising delicacy. "I know," replied Victoria, discovering that for the first time, she really wanted that closeness. What followed wasn't a transaction or a contractual obligation, but a genuine encounter between two people beginning to discover each other. Henry demonstrated a patience and consideration that completely contradicted his reputation as a cold and calculating man. And Victoria, to her own surprise, found not only comfort in his arms, but unexpected pleasure. Afterward, lying side by side in the dim room, a comfortable silence enveloped them. There was no need for words to name what had happened, a fundamental change in the dynamic between them, a door ajar to possibilities that no contract could foresee. "When we return to New York," Henry commented, breaking the silence, "things will be different from what we initially planned." "How so?" asked Victoria, turning to face him. "I don't want a facade marriage," he replied, with a conviction that surprised her. "I don't know exactly what I want, to be honest, but it won't be a simple business transaction." Victoria observed his profile in the semi-darkness, noticing the lines of tension in his face that were beginning to soften. Perhaps she was witnessing a thawing, slow, unpredictable, but real. "And the contract?" she asked, remembering the document that had sealed that union. Henry turned to her, his eyes reflecting the dim light coming through the window. "Some contracts are made to be renegotiated," he replied, with what could be interpreted as the beginning of a smile. The next morning, as the private plane took them back to America, Victoria looked out the window and reflected on the unexpected journey of the past 2 weeks. She wasn't in love. It would be naive to confuse gratitude and physical attraction with love, but there was a seed of something planted between them, something that not even the most detailed prenuptial contract could have predicted or controlled. Beside her, Henry worked on his laptop, but from time to time his eyes drifted to her with an expression that mixed curiosity and something that could, perhaps with time, transform into genuine affection. The return to New York City brought with it the accelerated rhythm of the metropolis and the challenges of building a conjugal routine that hadn't been planned. Henry's mansion on the Upper East Side, a contemporary-lined mansion surrounded by a meticulously tended garden, became the setting for this new phase. For Victoria, accustomed to the family apartment on the Upper West Side, the amplitude and discreet luxury of that space were both impressive and intimidating. "This will be your office," explained Henry, showing her a spacious room with windows overlooking the inner garden. "I had it equipped with everything an architect might need. If anything is missing, just ask." The gesture surprised her. When she had agreed to the marriage, Victoria had resigned herself to temporarily abandoning her career, focusing only on the social functions of a prominent businessman's wife. The idea that Henry had considered her professional ambitions was unexpected and, in a way, moving. "You don't need to work at Montgomery Architecture now," he continued, seeming to read her thoughts. "But I imagine you'll want to keep your skills sharp. Besides, you might be able to collaborate on some Blackwell Group projects if you're interested." "Thank you," replied Victoria, genuinely grateful. "This means a lot to me." A discreet smile appeared on Henry's lips, that same rare smile she had noticed during the honeymoon. "I'm not doing you a favor. It would be a waste not to take advantage of your talent. In the following weeks, a surprisingly harmonious routine was established. Henry maintained his intense schedule of meetings and corporate trips, but began to make small adjustments to include Victoria in his life. They had dinner together whenever possible, occasionally attended cultural events, and on nights when both were at home, shared moments of intimacy that gradually became more natural and less calculated. Victoria, in turn, divided her time between personal architecture projects, visits to her family, and adaptation to the role of Mrs. Blackwell. She was surprised to discover that, despite the unusual circumstances, there were genuinely pleasant aspects to her new status. Henry, although still reserved, showed a respect and consideration she hadn't expected, consulting her on decisions related to the house and even on some business matters. It was during a lunch with Lauren, 3 months after the wedding, that Victoria realized how much her life had changed. "You seem happy," observed her sister, studying her with curiosity. "Is it real, or have you become an excellent actress?" Victoria smiled, absent-mindedly stirring her salad. "A bit of both, maybe. The situation isn't what I imagined, but it has its good moments." "And Henry? Does he remain the walking iceberg we met?" "He's thawing, little by little." Victoria chose her words carefully. "There's more to him than appears at first sight." Lauren raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Are you developing Stockholm Syndrome, or do you really like him?" The question caught Victoria off guard. She had never so clearly formulated her feelings for her husband. There was gratitude, certainly, growing respect, undeniable physical attraction, but could something deeper be forming? "It's complicated," she finally replied. "We're really getting to know each other only now after the wedding. It's a strange order for things, isn't it?" "As long as you're okay," Lauren held her hand across the table. "And if he hurts you in any way, remember that I know where his office is, and I have an excellent sense of timing for interrupting important meetings." Victoria laughed, feeling blessed to have such a protective sister. The conversation shifted to other subjects: Lauren's college, their father's health, the news from the old family company, now stabilized under the joint management of August and executives appointed by Henry. It was the following week, after a series of morning sickness that she initially attributed to food poisoning, that Victoria took the pregnancy test. The confirmation came as a shock. They hadn't planned a pregnancy so soon, although the contract explicitly mentioned the expectation of heirs. Sitting on the edge of the bathtub, the positive test between her trembling fingers, Victoria tried to process the whirlwind of emotions that invaded her. There was fear, of course, in the face of the magnitude of that change. There was also a surprising joy, which she hadn't expected to feel, and there was, above all, uncertainty about how Henry would react. She decided to tell him that same night, during dinner. She prepared the table with special care, chose a dress she knew he appreciated, and tried to control the nervousness that grew with each hour. Henry arrived punctually at 8, as usual. He immediately noticed the special preparations and raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Any occasion I've forgotten?" he asked, placing a light kiss on her forehead, another gesture that had become habitual in recent weeks. "Not exactly," replied Victoria, leading him to the table. "But we have something important to discuss." Dinner proceeded with light conversation about each other's day, but Victoria could barely concentrate. Henry, always observant, noticed her distraction. "You seem nervous," he commented after dessert. "Is it something serious?" Victoria took a deep breath, gathering courage. "I'm pregnant," she finally announced, closely observing his reaction. For a moment that seemed to extend indefinitely, Henry was completely still, as if her words had frozen time. Then, slowly, a series of emotions crossed his face: surprise, confusion, and something Victoria couldn't immediately identify. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice controlled, but with an underlying tension. "I took the test today. We need to confirm with a doctor, but yes, I'm almost certain." Henry nodded, absorbing the information. He rose abruptly and walked to the window, turning his back to her. The silence that followed was dense, loaded with meanings Victoria couldn't decipher. "A child," he finally said, still with his back turned. "This changes everything." There was something in the way he said those words that lit an alarm inside Victoria. It wasn't the reaction of a man happy with the news, nor even that of someone resigned to an anticipated responsibility. It was something close to suspicion. "We didn't plan this," she said cautiously, "but it happened, and now we need to decide how to deal with this new reality." When Henry turned around, his face had returned to the mask of control she had known at the beginning. "Certainly," he responded, with a formality he hadn't used for weeks. "We'll schedule an appointment tomorrow to confirm and start proper monitoring." That night, for the first time since the honeymoon, they slept on opposite sides of the bed, an invisible abyss growing between them. Victoria could feel that something fundamental had changed, but didn't understand exactly what. In the days that followed, the pregnancy was confirmed by the doctor, and Henry assumed an almost corporate posture towards the situation. He provided the best specialists, ordered adaptations to the house for the future baby, and included Victoria in his premium health insurance. Everything practical, efficient, and completely devoid of emotion. More disturbing than that was his gradual distancing. Conversations during dinner became scarce, nights of intimacy disappeared, and he began to travel more frequently, extending commitments he previously tried to abbreviate. 2 weeks after confirmation of the pregnancy, Victoria finally confronted him. "What's happening, Henry? Since I told you about the baby, you've been acting as if I were a stranger." He looked up from the documents he was analyzing, his gaze impenetrable. "I'm busy with the group's expansion in the Northeast. Nothing more than that." "Don't lie to me," she insisted, with a firmness that surprised him. "You're deliberately avoiding me." A tense silence established itself between them. Finally, Henry closed the document folder with a calculated movement. "I received interesting information from my lawyers," he said, with a coldness Victoria hadn't heard in months. "Apparently, there's a clause in our prenuptial agreement that wasn't adequately explained to me before signing. A clause that establishes that, in case of pregnancy in the first 2 years of marriage, you would be entitled to a substantially larger share of the Blackwell family assets." The implicit accusation hit Victoria like a physical blow. "Are you suggesting I deliberately got pregnant to obtain financial advantages?" "I'm noting an interesting coincidence," he replied, with that same controlled voice he used in difficult negotiations. "A hidden clause and an unplanned pregnancy." Victoria felt tears burn her eyes but refused to let them fall. "I didn't even know about the existence of this clause. And if you're insinuating I planned this pregnancy, you forgot it was you who insisted on not using protection in recent weeks." It was true. After the first few times when they had used condoms, it had been Henry himself who suggested they were no longer necessary, incorrectly assuming she was using some contraceptive method. A flash of doubt crossed his face, quickly replaced by the impenetrable mask. "In any case, I've requested a complete review of the contract. My lawyers are working on it." "Do what you think is necessary," replied Victoria, her voice trembling with anger and hurt. "But know that never, at any time, did I try to deceive you. I thought we had overcome this mutual distrust, but apparently I was wrong." She left the room with firm steps, but as soon as she closed the bedroom door behind her, she allowed the tears to finally fall. That setback hurt more than she expected, because at some point along the way, without realizing it, she had begun to really care for Henry, to value the fragile connection they had built. That night, as she stared at the ceiling of the bedroom, one hand resting protectively on her still flat belly, Victoria made a decision. She wouldn't beg for trust or affection. If Henry had chosen to return to the initial coldness, she would survive, no longer just for her family or the company, but now for the child she carried. What she didn't know was that, in the office, downstairs, Henry Blackwell stared at an untouched glass of whiskey, divided between the deep-rooted distrust that had shaped his entire adult life and the growing suspicion that, for the first time, he might be making an irreparable mistake. The following weeks passed in an atmosphere of forced civility. Victoria and Henry cohabited the same space, occasionally shared meals, but the abyss between them seemed to grow each day. She immersed herself in work, agreeing to collaborate on a restoration project for a historic building in downtown New York, a welcome distraction for her mind and wounded heart. The pregnancy progressed without complications. Her body was beginning to show the first subtle changes, a small curve that was only noticeable when she was undressed. At medical appointments, Henry punctually attended, asking technical and precise questions to the obstetrician, but avoiding any emotional contact with Victoria or with the idea of the baby. It was on a rainy August afternoon that Carmen, the housekeeper who had worked for Henry for more than a decade, discreetly knocked on the door of Victoria's office. "Ma'am, sorry to interrupt," said the woman with evident discomfort, "but there's something you need to know." Victoria pushed away the architectural plans she was analyzing, intrigued by the seriousness on the housekeeper's face, who normally maintained absolute discretion about household matters. "What is it, Carmen? Did something happen?" The woman entered, closing the door behind her. "It's about Mr. Henry and that meeting with the lawyers last night." Victoria felt a tightness in her chest. She knew Henry was still investigating the clause in the prenuptial agreement, but he no longer shared anything about the matter with her. "You shouldn't be listening to private conversations, Carmen," she warned, more for formality than for real censure. "I know, ma'am, and I apologize, but when I served coffee, I heard something that worried me." Carmen hesitated, visibly divided between loyalty to her longtime employer and what she considered right. They were talking about an annulment. The word fell like a stone in Victoria's stomach. "Annulment of the marriage?" "Yes, ma'am. One of the lawyers said it would be possible, based on something about vitiated consent or omission of critical information. Mr. Henry didn't seem entirely convinced, but asked them to prepare the documents anyway." Victoria thanked the housekeeper and asked to be left alone. As soon as the door closed, she allowed herself a moment of fragility, her trembling hands covering her face. The idea of Henry seeking to annul the marriage, especially now, with a child on the way, was devastating, not just for the practical implications, but for what it represented emotionally. That night, when Henry arrived home, Victoria was waiting for him in the living room, determined to face the situation head-on. "We need to talk," she said, as soon as he entered. "About the annulment you're planning." Henry froze momentarily, his dark eyes registering surprise before he composed himself. "I see the walls have ears in this house. It doesn't matter how I found out. What matters is that you're making decisions that affect my life and our child's without even consulting me." He walked to the bar and poured himself a drink. A gesture Victoria had noticed was his ritual when he needed to gain time to organize his thoughts. "I haven't made any definitive decision," he finally replied. "I'm just exploring options." "Options to get rid of me and the baby?" Victoria's voice trembled slightly, betraying her contained emotion. "To protect my interests," he corrected, with that corporate coldness she had learned to detest. "You can't blame me for being cautious when there are millions at stake." "That money never interested me, Henry. Never." Victoria stood up, confronting him directly. "If you want, I can sign a document right now waiving any additional right provided in this clause that so disturbs you." Something changed in his gaze, a shadow of doubt, perhaps. "It wouldn't be legally binding." "Then have your lawyers draft something that is." "But stop this annulment charade, for God's sake." Frustration finally broke Victoria's carefully maintained composure. "I'm carrying your child. A child that, by the way, you actively participated in conceiving. And your response is to try to get rid of us?" Henry put the glass on the table with more force than necessary. "It's not that simple, Victoria. I've spent my life watching people manipulate contracts and relationships to gain advantages. My own father." "I am not your father, nor your mother, nor anyone who has hurt you in the past," Victoria interrupted him, light years away from the resigned young woman who had walked down the aisle months before. "I'm the woman who agreed to marry you to save my family, who tried to make this marriage work, who began to believe that maybe we could build something real together." The silence that followed was loaded with unspoken emotions. Henry observed her as if seeing her in a new light, that pregnant woman with eyes bright with indignation and cheeks flushed with emotion. So different from the submissive young woman he had expected when proposing that agreement. "The papers of the original contract," he finally said. "Did you read them before signing?" The question caught Victoria by surprise. Of course I did. It was 20 pages of legal terms. All the pages, including the annexes and addenda? Something in his insistence made her hesitate. A distant memory emerged. The stack of documents in her father's office, the pressure of time, the pen quickly passing over the dotted lines indicated by Henry's legal assistant. I'm not sure if I read every word," she finally admitted. "Everything was happening so fast, and your lawyer indicated where to sign." Henry stared at her intently. "You signed in blank? Without reading?" "Not exactly in blank. I read the main parts, the ones your lawyer highlighted. I trusted there wouldn't be any traps." An expression of absolute incredulity took over Henry's face. "You trusted? In me? In my lawyers? Even knowing it was essentially a commercial agreement?" Victoria felt her face burn with shame and frustration. "Yes, I trusted. Maybe I was naive, but at that moment I was more concerned with saving my family than protecting myself from hidden clauses." Henry ran his hand through his hair, a rare gesture that revealed his internal disturbance. "This changes everything," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "What? The fact that I was too trusting?" asked Victoria, confused by his reaction. "The fact that you didn't know about the clause," he replied, looking at her directly. "If you didn't know about the financial benefit in case of pregnancy, you couldn't have planned." Understanding hit Victoria like lightning. "You think that I got pregnant on purpose to get more money?" His silence was answer enough. My God, Henry. Victoria felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. "Is that what you think of me? After everything?" "It's what I thought," he corrected, his voice softer now. "Until this moment." A tense silence established itself between them. Victoria struggled to process what she had just heard, his distrust, the implicit accusation, and now this apparent change of perspective. "I don't know if this makes things better or worse," she finally said. "The fact that you believed I would be capable of something like that. I was conditioned to expect the worst from people," Henry replied, with a raw honesty he rarely demonstrated, especially when money is involved. "Well, now you know. The truth. I have no interest in your money beyond the security it provides for our family, including this baby." Victoria instinctively placed her hand on her belly. "If you want to proceed with the annulment, I won't fight against it, but know that you'll be rejecting not just me, but a real chance to have the family you never had." She turned to leave the room, feeling emotionally exhausted. Before she reached the door, Henry's voice stopped her. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'd like you to accompany me to Dr. Mendez's office." Victoria looked at him, confused. "Your lawyer?" "Yes, I want you to personally see the original contract, all the pages, including the one containing the clause in question." "Why?" "Because we need total clarity before proceeding in any direction," he replied, with a seriousness that admitted no questioning. "And because I think we both may have been manipulated in this story." The night was long and restless for both. Victoria, lying in her bed, alone as had become habitual in recent weeks, reflected on the conversation. There was something in Henry's reaction that didn't make complete sense. Why such surprise to know she hadn't read the entire contract, and why the insistence on checking the original document together? The answer came the following morning in the opulent office of Dr. Mendez, a middle-aged corporate lawyer whose neutral expression revealed absolutely nothing. Before them, on the polished mahogany table, was the original contract, all 52 pages, including annexes and addenda. "I want Mrs. Blackwell to see page 37, the one containing the clause about pregnancy," instructed Henry, with a calmness that contrasted with the evident tension in his shoulders. The lawyer, visibly uncomfortable, leafed through the document to the indicated page and turned it so Victoria could read. She leaned over the paper, studying the dense legal text. "Do you see your signature at the bottom of the page?" asked Henry. Victoria examined carefully. "Yes, it's here." "Now look carefully at the page number in the footer and compare it with the previous page and the next one. Intrigued, Victoria did as he suggested. It was then that she noticed the formatting of the page number was slightly different. Moreover, the font used in the text of that specific page, although very similar, was not identical to the rest of the document. This page, she began, confused, was inserted afterward, completed Henry. His gaze now turned to the lawyer, who seemed to have aged 10 years in the last 5 minutes. Isn't that right, Dr. Mendez? The lawyer swallowed hard, adjusting his tie as if it had suddenly become too tight. Mr. Blackwell, I can explain— Oh, I'm sure you can, interrupted Henry, his voice dangerously controlled. Just as you'll be able to explain to the Bar Ethics Council and possibly to a criminal judge. Victoria observed the scene, dazed. Are you saying this clause is false, that it was inserted after we signed? Exactly that, confirmed Henry, and I suspect without the knowledge of either of us. Which leads me to ask, who would benefit from this, Dr. Mendez? Who paid you to insert this page? The lawyer visibly paled. No one paid me, Mr. Blackwell. It was a suggestion from Mr. Montgomery. He thought it would be an additional protection for his daughter in case— My father. Victoria felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. My father asked you to do this? He was concerned about your future. The lawyer tried to justify, his voice weak. He wanted to ensure you were protected in any circumstance. He said Mr. Blackwell certainly wouldn't object, since an heir was part of the agreement, but preferred not to mention it, explicitly to avoid embarrassment. Henry rose abruptly. This is forgery of a document, Dr. Mendez, and contract manipulation. I want your letter of resignation from the Blackwell Group in 1 hour. They left the office in silence, each absorbing the implications of that revelation. In the elevator, descending the 30 floors of the corporate building, Victoria finally found her voice. I'm sorry for what my father did, she said, genuinely dismayed. He had no right— He was trying to protect you, interrupted Henry, surprising her, in a completely wrong and potentially criminal way, but I understand the impulse. When they reached the ground floor, instead of heading to the parking lot, Henry led her to a nearby cafe. They chose a discreet table in the back and placed their orders, an espresso for him, a ginger tea for her, good for pregnancy nausea. So, Victoria finally said, unable to bear the silence any longer, what happens now? Henry studied her, for a long moment, his dark eyes inscrutable. Now we have the truth. You didn't know about the clause because it didn't exist when you signed. I didn't know because it was inserted without my knowledge. Neither of us tried to deceive the other. And the annulment, she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. There will be no annulment, he replied, with a certainty that took her by surprise. Unless that's what you want now that you know what your father did. Victoria felt a lump in her throat. It's not what I want. Something softened in Henry's gaze, a tension that dissipated, a wall that began to crumble. It's not what I want either, he admitted, extending his hand across the table to touch hers. I realized, during these weeks, that the idea of losing you and our child was more painful than any financial risk. The confession, so simple and direct, made Victoria's eyes fill with tears. It wasn't a declaration of love. Henry wasn't a man of grand romantic gestures, but it was honest, and at that moment, it was exactly what she needed to hear. The 5th month of pregnancy brought with it a new phase for Victoria and Henry. The reconciliation after the episode of the false clause had been cautious, like two dancers relearning each other's steps, but genuine. Henry, still reserved by nature, began to show a growing interest in the pregnancy, attending all appointments, asking questions to the doctor, and even, to Victoria's surprise, reading books about fetal development and parenthood. The mansion on the Upper East Side also underwent transformations. One of the rooms near the master suite was designated as the baby's room, and Henry insisted that Victoria have complete freedom to decorate it as she wished. She dove into the project with enthusiasm, applying her talent for architecture and interior design in creating a welcoming and sophisticated space. We still don't know if it's a boy or a girl, commented Victoria, as she showed Henry the inspiration panels she had created. So I thought of a neutral color scheme, with touches of aqua and pale yellow. It's perfect, he replied, studying the drawings with genuine attention. But I have a suggestion, if I may. He left the office and returned minutes later with an object wrapped in cloth. As he unwrapped it, he revealed a small wooden sculpture, an artisanal mobile with delicately carved birds. It was mine when I was a baby, he explained, with a vulnerability that Victoria rarely witnessed. The only thing my mother left behind when she departed. The gesture moved her deeply. It was more than the offer of an object. It was Henry sharing a part of his history, of his pain, and wishing that something significant from his past would be part of his child's future. It's beautiful, she said, gently touching one of the wooden birds. It will have the place of honor in the room. That moment marked a subtle but significant change. In the days that followed, Henry began to talk more about his childhood, not just the difficult moments after his mother's departure, but also older and happier memories, which he seemed to rediscover as he prepared for fatherhood. The visit to the doctor for the morphological ultrasound was another important milestone. Lying on the table with the cold gel on her now visibly rounded belly, Victoria held Henry's hand while the doctor slid the transducer, capturing images of the baby. "Do you want to know the sex?" asked Dr. Paul, a renowned obstetrician that Henry had insisted on hiring. They exchanged a look, having previously agreed that yes, they wanted to know. Henry nodded, his hand slightly squeezing Victoria's. "It's a girl," announced the doctor, pointing to the screen, "and from what I see, she's perfectly healthy. Development appropriate for gestational age. Strong heartbeat." "A girl," repeated. Henry and Victoria was surprised to see his eyes watery, the first time she had seen him so close to crying. "We're going to have a daughter." That night, as they dined on the veranda overlooking the illuminated garden, they discussed names. Henry suggested Eliza in honor of Victoria's mother, another gesture that demonstrated how far they had come since the calculating marriage of the beginning. "It's a beautiful name," agreed Victoria, moved by the consideration. "But I was thinking of Hannah." "Hannah," repeated Henry, as if testing the sound. "It's strong and classic. For any special reason?" Victoria hesitated. "It was your mother's name, wasn't it? You mentioned it once, during the trip to Italy." It was Henry's turn to be moved, though he tried to disguise it, taking a long sip of wine. "You remembered that?" "I remember everything you tell me about yourself," she replied simply. "They're two rare moments to be forgotten." The smile he directed at her then was different from all the previous ones, open, genuine, almost vulnerable. "Hannah Eliza Blackwell," he finally said. "Sounds like the name of someone who will make history." 2 weeks later, the life they were beginning to build together faced its first major test. Victoria was alone at home, working in her office, when she felt a sudden dizziness as she stood up. She tried to reach the phone, but before she could, her vision darkened and she fell, hitting her temple on the edge of the desk. It was Carmen who found her minutes later, semi-conscious and with a trickle of blood running down her face. The housekeeper acted quickly, calling an ambulance and then calling Henry, who was in a crucial meeting with international investors. "Mr. Blackwell," Carmen's voice trembled on the telephone line. "Mrs. Victoria fell and is injured. The ambulance is on its way, but I thought you should know immediately." Henry didn't hesitate. "The baby?" was his first question, his voice tense. "We don't know yet. She's conscious but confused." "Which hospital are they taking her to?" "Mount Sinai, sir." "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Henry excused himself. To the Japanese investors, without elaborate explanations. Something unthinkable for the meticulous man he was before meeting Victoria. His driver broke speed records through New York City's congested avenues, and when he finally arrived at the hospital, Victoria was already being examined. "I'm the husband," he announced at the reception, with an urgency he didn't bother to disguise. "Victoria Blackwell, she's pregnant and suffered a fall." He was led to a waiting area adjacent to the examination room, where a doctor came to meet him minutes later. "Mr. Blackwell, Your wife suffered a mild concussion and required a few stitches in her temple, explained the doctor. As for the baby, we're monitoring, but the heartbeat is normal and there are no signs of placental abruption, which is the main concern in these cases. What was the cause of the fall? Asked Henry, trying to maintain his composure. Hypotension, low blood pressure. It's common in pregnancy, especially when one rises too quickly. We'll keep her under observation for 24 hours, but the prognosis is good for mother and daughter. When he was finally allowed to enter the room, Henry felt his heart tighten at the sight of Victoria in the hospital bed, pale with a bandage on her temple and connected to monitors that tracked her vital signs and the baby's. "Hey," she murmured, trying to smile despite the evident pain. "Looks like I gave everyone a scare." Henry approached, holding her hand as if it was something infinitely precious. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," she replied, with a weak smile. "But the doctor said Hannah is fine, that's what matters." "You matter too," he said, with an intensity that surprised her. "Much more than I ever imagined possible." That night in the hospital was revealing for both. Henry refused to leave Victoria's side, sleeping uncomfortably in a chair next to the bed, rising at every noise from the monitors, constantly checking if she and the baby were okay. In the morning, when the doctor made his rounds, he found Henry, already awake, meticulously reviewing his wife's medical chart. "I see we have a very attentive husband," commented the doctor as he examined the wound on Victoria's temple. "He hasn't left your side for a second." "He can be quite protective when he wants to be," replied Victoria, exchanging a meaningful look with Henry. "It's my duty to protect you," he answered, with a simplicity that hid the depth of the feeling. "You two are my responsibility now." When they were discharged the next day, Henry surprised Victoria once again. Instead of delegating care to a nurse, as would be expected from an executive of his caliber, he completely reorganized his schedule. For the next 2 weeks, canceling even an international trip that had been planned for months. "The company can survive without me for a few days," he explained, when she questioned. "For you and Hannah, I'm not so sure." The days that followed consolidated the transformation in their relationship. Henry, always so independent and distant, found himself unable to stay away from Victoria for long, as if he feared something might happen in his absence. He worked predominantly from home, frequently interrupting what he was doing to check if she was comfortable, if she had eaten properly, if she was following the medical recommendations. "I never imagined Henry Blackwell could transform into a doting husband," Lauren joked during a visit. "The last time I saw him, he seemed like a walking block of ice." "People change," replied Victoria, watching fondly as Henry discussed with the gardener about removing potentially toxic plants from the garden, preparing the house for their daughters, arrival still months away. "You love him," Lauren stated, not as a question but as an observation. Victoria didn't respond immediately. The word love had never been pronounced between her and Henry, not even in the most intimate moments. There was gratitude, certainly, growing respect, undeniable physical attraction. But could it be love? "I think so," she finally admitted, surprising herself with the simplicity of the realization. "And I think he loves me too, even if he's never said it." That night, while Henry worked in his office, Victoria decided to confront the safe that her father had given her months before, the one that had belonged to her mother, and that should be opened on her wedding day. The small wooden object had remained forgotten during the whole whirlwind of the first months of marriage, but now, with life taking a more stable course, she felt ready for that encounter with the past. The key, as her father had said, was among her mother's belongings, in a small jewelry box she kept with care. It was an antique key delicately crafted that fit perfectly into the safe's lock. Inside, she found a yellowed envelope addressed to her, with Eliza Montgomery's elegant handwriting. With a racing heart, she carefully opened it. The letter, dated a few weeks before her mother's death, revealed itself as a farewell message, one that Eliza had never had the opportunity to deliver personally. "My dear Victoria," the letter began, "when you read these words, I will probably no longer be here. The doctors are not optimistic, and I have been trying to prepare myself for the inevitable. But before I depart, I need to share something important with you. A secret I've kept for years, waiting for the right moment to reveal. Victoria continued reading, her heart beating stronger and stronger as she absorbed her mother's words. The letter revealed that, contrary to what she had always believed, the family's financial situation was not as desperate as her father had made it seem. Eliza had inherited substantial property from a distant uncle, a piece of land on the Long Island coast that, with the real estate boom of recent years, had appreciated considerably. Your father never knew about this inheritance, the letter continued. It was an agreement between me and my uncle, who never fully trusted August's ability to manage money. The land is in your name, Victoria, in a trust account that will become accessible when you turn 26 or on the day of your marriage, whichever comes first. 26 years. Victoria had just turned that age 3 weeks before. If she had known this, if she had opened the safe before. My greatest fear, Eliza continued, is that your father, in his desperation to maintain appearances and the family's status, might pressure you into a marriage of convenience. I know August. I know how persuasive he can be when it comes to the good of the family. That's why I leave this letter, so you'll know you have options, that you have financial independence. Never marry out of obligation, my daughter. Marry only for love, or don't marry at all. Tears streamed down Victoria's face as she finished reading the letter. Words of maternal love, advice for life, and finally, the banking and legal information necessary to access her inheritance. An inheritance that, if discovered in time, would have made her marriage to Henry unnecessary. This revelation should have devastated her, should have filled her with anger against her father for concealing such information. Instead, what she felt was a surprising relief, because now, sitting in the house she shared with Henry, carrying their daughter, she realized she wouldn't change her decision even if she had known. At that moment, Henry entered the room, interrupting her thoughts. He stopped upon seeing the tears on her face and the letter in her hands. "What happened?" he asked, immediately concerned, approaching her. Victoria silently extended the letter, allowing him to read. She observed his expression change as he absorbed the information, surprise, understanding, and finally a shadow of uncertainty that he rarely demonstrated. "You never needed to marry me," he stated, after finishing the reading. "If you had discovered this before." "If I had discovered this before," interrupted Victoria, standing up to face him, "perhaps we would never have gotten married, and we would never have Hannah, and I would never have discovered that the feared Henry Blackwell is in fact a man capable of loving." "Loving," he repeated, as if testing the sound of the word on his lips. "Yes, loving," she confirmed, holding his hands, "because that's what you feel, isn't it? Even if you've never said it." Henry looked at her for a long time, his eyes revealing a vulnerability that few had witnessed. "I never thought I would be capable," he finally admitted. "I believed that capacity had been extirpated from me long ago. But you, and now Hannah, you've changed everything." He pulled her closer, one hand resting gently on the belly where their daughter was growing. "I love you, Victoria. Not for the contract, not for the company, not for social convenience. Simply because you are you, and because, in some inexplicable way, you managed to teach me to love again." The kiss that followed wasn't like the others. It wasn't the cold seal of the wedding day, nor the cautious exploration of the honeymoon, not even the physical passion they had discovered afterward. It was a promise, a new beginning, the celebration of something they had built together piece by piece, overcoming distrust and old wounds. The last trimester of pregnancy brought with it a radiant Victoria and a completely transformed Henry. The mansion on the Upper East Side, once an impeccably decorated but warmth-deprived space, now pulsed with the expectation of the new life that would arrive. Hannah's room was ready, an oasis in soft tones, with the wooden bird mobile occupying the place of honor above the meticulously chosen crib. Henry surprised everyone by announcing he would take a 3-month paternity leave when his daughter was born, something unprecedented in the American corporate environment, especially for a CEO of his stature. The news caused a stir in the specialized press and agitated the financial market, but he remained unyielding. "My father was never present," he explained to Victoria, while adjusting the last picture on the baby's room wall. "He always prioritized business, meetings, trips. I won't make the same mistake." The decision to temporarily appoint Carlos Mendoza, his longtime CFO, as interim CEO was met with apprehension by the board, but Henry wouldn't be dissuaded. The B. Company will survive. I built a solid team precisely for moments like this. On a rainy October afternoon, while Victoria rested in the living room leafing through an architecture magazine, the phone rang. It was her father, August, asking to visit them, a rare request, considering the distance that had been established after the discovery of the prenuptial contract manipulation. "I don't know if it's a good idea," commented Henry when she told him about the phone call. "I don't want you to be stressed." Victoria smiled, touched by the concern. "I need to make peace with him before Hannah is born. He's the only grandfather she'll have." Henry nodded, respecting her decision. "I'll be by your side if you want." The next day, August Montgomery arrived punctually for afternoon tea. He seemed older and more tired than Victoria remembered, his shoulders slightly stooped, his hair thinner. The expression on his face upon seeing his daughter 8 months pregnant was a mixture of joy and deep regret. "You look beautiful," he said, hugging her carefully. "Thank you for coming, Dad," replied Victoria, leading him to the living room where Henry awaited them. The greeting between the two men was formal but civilized. They sat down, and Carmen served the tea specially, prepared for the occasion. "I came to ask forgiveness," August began without preamble, after an initially awkward silence, "from both of you, but especially from you, Victoria. What I did was unforgivable." "Why, Dad?" she asked, the question that had tormented her for months. "Why resort to something as extreme as falsifying a legal document?" August lowered his eyes, ashamed. "Panic, desperation. After discovering your mother's letter and the inheritance, I realized you no longer needed to marry Henry. I feared you might give up on the agreement and that the company, our family's legacy, would be lost." "So, you knew about the inheritance?" Victoria felt a renewed pang of hurt. "All this time?" "I discovered it by chance, days before the wedding, when your uncle's estate lawyer contacted me to inform about the transfer of assets," confessed August. "That's when I realized Eliza had kept me in the dark all those years. I panicked and did something terrible." "You manipulated your own daughter," intervened Henry, his voice controlled but firm. "You allowed her to believe she had no choice." "Yes," admitted August without trying to defend himself, "and there isn't a day I don't bitterly regret it. When I heard about the pregnancy, the guilt became unbearable. I feared that this manipulation might destroy what you were building." Victoria observed her father, a man who had always seemed strong and decisive to her, now reduced by his own mistakes. She felt compassion mixed with hurt. "What's done is done," she finally said. "I can't say I completely forgive you, not yet, but Hannah deserves to know her grandfather, and I want us to make peace." "Thank you," murmured August, visibly moved. "I promise to be a better grandfather than I was a father." Henry, who had observed the scene in calculated silence, finally spoke. "Mr. Montgomery, what happened was serious, a breach of trust that could have serious legal consequences. But for Victoria and our daughter, I'm willing to put this behind us with one condition." "What would that be?" asked August, tense. "That you be honest from now on, completely honest, with Victoria, with me, and with our daughter when she grows up. No more secrets, no more manipulations, no matter the justification." August nodded solemnly. "You have my word. And know that despite the circumstances, I'm genuinely happy to see the man you've become. You're not the same one who proposed that cold agreement a year ago." A small smile appeared on Henry's face. "No, I'm definitely not the same man." The reconciliation, though fragile, brought a sense of closure for Victoria. A wound was beginning to heal just in time for Hannah's arrival. That night, lying next to Henry, she felt a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. "Are you okay?" he asked, caressing her hair. "Better than I expected," she replied, nestling against his chest. as if a cycle is completing so another can begin. 2 weeks later, during a meeting in the Home Office, Victoria felt the first contractions. They were mild, spaced out, but unmistakable. Hannah had decided it was time to come into the world 3 weeks before the due date. "I think it's started," she calmly announced to Henry, who was discussing market strategies with his team via video conference. Never has a CEO's meeting been ended so abruptly. With impressive efficiency, Henry activated the carefully elaborated plan for that moment. The hospital bag already prepared was placed in the car. Carmen was informed, the doctor was alerted, and in less than 20 minutes, they were on their way to the maternity ward. "How are you feeling?" asked Henry, holding Victoria's hand as the driver navigated through New York City's chaotic traffic. "Scared, anxious, happy," she replied, smiling despite the growing discomfort. "And you?" "Terrified," he admitted, with an honesty that would have been unthinkable months before, "but ready. I'll be by your side every moment." Arrival at Mount Sinai Hospital was followed by a sequence of expected procedures: triage, monitoring, Dr. Paul's visit confirming that yes, Hannah was really on her way. The contractions intensified gradually, and Victoria discovered an inner strength she didn't know she possessed. Henry didn't leave her side for a single second. He held her hand during the strongest contractions, applied cold compresses to her forehead, helped her with breathing techniques, and offered words of encouragement that, coming from that once so contained man, meant more than any grand gesture. It was during one of these particularly intense contractions that Henry's phone rang insistently. He ignored the first few calls, but on the fourth attempt he excused himself to check. "It's Carlos," he explained, referring to the interim CEO. "It must be urgent for him to insist so much." He moved away just enough to answer, remaining within Victoria's sight. She observed his expression change from concern to shock, and then to something that seemed like indecision, a rarity for Henry Blackwell. When he returned to her side, there was an evident tension in his face. "What happened?" asked Victoria between controlled breaths. Henry hesitated. "The Japanese accepted the deal, the one we've been negotiating for months for the expansion in Asia. But there's a condition. They want to sign personally tonight before they return to Tokyo early tomorrow." "Tonight?" Victoria felt a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the contractions. "Here in New York?" "Yes, the company president came especially for this. It's a unique opportunity. We're talking billions of dollars, hundreds of jobs." Victoria saw the conflict in his eyes, the calculating businessman he had always been versus the man he had become in recent months. "You should go," she said, surprising them both. "What?" "No, absolutely not. Hannah is being born." "And she will be born whether you're in a meeting or not," argued Victoria, with a serenity that contrasted with the physical pain she felt. "Dr. Paul said it will still take hours. You can go, sign the deal, and come back." Henry seemed genuinely divided, something unthinkable for the man she had met at the beginning. "I won't leave you alone at this moment." "I won't be alone. Lauren is on her way, and the medical team is excellent." Victoria held his hand tightly. "This deal is important for the Blackwell Group, for the employees, for the future we'll build, for Hannah." For a moment it seemed Henry was considering the possibility. Then, to Victoria's surprise, he decisively shook his head. "No," he said with absolute certainty. "A year ago I would have gone, maybe even 6 months ago, but now I know what truly matters." He picked up the phone and called Carlos back. "Tell the Japanese I appreciate the trust, but my daughter is being born, and there's no deal in the world that would take me away from this moment. If they want to wait until tomorrow, great. If not, we'll seek other partners." He paused, listening to the response on the other end. "Yes, I'm absolutely certain. Good luck." He hung up and turned his attention entirely to Victoria, whose eyes were watery not from the pain of contractions, but from the depth of that gesture. "You just refused $1 billion deal for me," she stated, incredulous. "For us," he corrected, kissing her forehead. "For our family. Because I finally understood what my father never comprehended, that no fortune in the world is worth missing the moments that truly matter." The following hours were intense, painful, and transformative. When the moment finally came for Hannah to come into the world, Henry was exactly where he had promised, by Victoria's side, holding her hand, encouraging her with words that came directly from a heart that finally had learned to love without reservations. "One more push," encouraged the doctor. "She's almost here." With a last impulse of determination, Victoria brought Hannah into the world, a perfect little life that, with her first cry, definitively sealed the transformation of Henry Blackwell. "She's beautiful," he whispered. When he could finally hold his daughter in his arms, a tear freely running down his face. Perfect like her mother. In the days that followed, as they adapted to the new routine with the baby, an envelope arrived at the mansion. It was from Carlos Mendoza, the interim CEO, containing surprising news. The Japanese investors, impressed with Henry's decision to prioritize his daughter's birth, had not only agreed to postpone the signing, but improved the terms of the deal. "They want to do business with a man who understands the true value of family," explained the attached note. "It seems your decision ended up being good for business too," commented Victoria, while nursing Hannah in the comfortable swing installed in the winter garden. Henry smiled, observing the two with an expression of contentment that would have been unimaginable on his once always serious face. Even if it weren't, it would be worth every penny lost. 2 weeks after Hannah's birth, on a sunny afternoon, Henry invited Victoria for a walk in the garden. The baby slept peacefully under the attentive care of Lauren, who had insisted on spending a few days with them to help. "I have something to show you," he said, leading her to a more secluded part of the garden. There, to Victoria's surprise, was a miniature replica of her mother's safe, the same one that had held the revealing letter. "What is this?" she asked, intrigued. "A new beginning," replied Henry, opening the small safe with a golden key. Or rather, the formalization of something that already began some time ago. Inside the safe was a legal document. Not a cold contract like the one that had started everything, but a new will. Victoria read with growing emotion. Henry had completely rewritten his patrimonial dispositions, leaving most of his fortune to her and Hannah, without any restrictive or conditional clauses. "It's not just about money," he explained, seeing her surprise. "It's about trust, about recognizing that our marriage ceased to be a business agreement a long time ago." Even more surprising was the second part of the document. Henry had structured the Blackwell Group so that in case of his death, Victoria would assume the presidency, with the support of an advisory board until Hannah was old enough to decide her own role in the family empire. "You trust me to manage your company?" she asked, genuinely surprised. "I trust you with everything I have and am," he simply replied. "You're not just my wife, Victoria. You're my partner in every possible sense." Beside the will, there was a third document, a project for a charitable foundation focused on supporting women entrepreneurs from underprivileged communities, which would bear the name Hannah Blackwell Foundation. "I want our daughter to grow up understanding that privilege brings responsibility," explained Henry. "That fortune without purpose is empty, something I learned from you." Victoria felt her eyes water, remembering the cold and calculating man she had met just over a year ago. The transformation was almost unbelievable, and yet completely authentic. "My mother's safe changed my life in ways I never imagined," she said, touching the miniature with affection. "First by revealing a truth that came too late to change my choices, and now by inspiring this. Sometimes the choices we make out of necessity end up being exactly the ones we should make out of love," reflected Henry, embracing her. "If you had discovered the inheritance before, perhaps we would never have gotten married, and I would never have discovered that I was still capable of loving." They walked back to the house, hand in hand, at the exact moment Hannah was beginning to wake up. At the sound of her daughter's soft cry, Victoria realized she had completed an unimaginable journey, from reluctant bride to beloved wife, from a piece in a business agreement to a life partner, from a young woman pressured by circumstances to a woman who chose her own destiny. When she entered the room and saw Henry picking up Hannah in his arms, talking softly to his daughter as if she could understand every word. Victoria knew with absolute certainty what had begun as a contract had transformed into something that no legal document could contain or define. Something that, unlike the business agreements that